we good? Are we live? Oh, wow, okay. Hey, everybody, welcome. Thanks so much for joining us today. I really feel like I'm on a panel among friends. So we have a few surprise guests with us today. Again, thanks for joining us for Metrics That Matter, how to forge more diverse and inclusive communities. My name is Nicole Huseman. I work at Intel. I'm a community and developer advocate, and I work with Danielle and Dawn on the Chaos Project, and I also work in advocacy for Kubernetes. I'd like for the panelists to introduce themselves. We'll talk a little bit about the Chaos Project and then really dive into diversity and inclusion and some of the great things that are happening in the Kubernetes community. So with that, Daniel.
Hello everyone, thank you very much for coming. My name is Daniel Izquierda, I'm one of the co-founders of Viteria. We've been running for the last 7 years approximately. We do software development analytics for open source and inner source projects. And I had the opportunity, it was a great pleasure to work with Nicole, producing the OpenStack gender report for the last couple of years approximately.
So I'm Dawn Foster. I've spent 20 plus years in the open source industry, and a lot of that I've spent being really passionate about having metrics to describe your open source projects and communities. So I'm a maintainer for the Chaos Project, which is a Linux Foundation metrics project. I work at Pivotal, where I'm responsible for our open source Kubernetes contribution strategy.
Hey, my name is Guinevere Sanger. I'm a software developer and end user of Kubernetes at GitHub, and I am a community contributor to Kubernetes as well. I write code, I write contributor docs, and I am a member of the special interest group Contributor Experience.
Hi, everyone. Oh, there we go. Oh, all right. Hi, everyone. My name is Jonas Rosland. I'm an open source community manager over at VMware. I was the lead for Contributor Summit here in Barcelona this year, working with wonderful volunteers. I see some Contributor Summit shirts over here, working with incredible volunteers for a couple of months to pull all that together. It's been fantastic. I'm also part of the Contributor Experience SIG.
Excellent. So thank you guys. So Daniel, can you talk a little bit about how the Chaos Project's diversity and inclusion workgroup was founded, what the basis was?
Yep, definitely. So, well, Chaos. Chaos is the acronym for Community Health Analytics for Open Source Project, for open source software. This all started in 2017 when this was announced by the Linux Foundation in LA. And well, basically there were a bunch of companies and open source foundations that were interested in metrics and in understanding what health means from a community perspective or from a software development perspective. So among others, it was Wikimedia Foundation, Mozilla Foundation, Red Hat, Viteria. We were there as well, and well, some other people interested in this. So then it happens that, well, we started to discuss, there is kind of two main committees, metrics committee defining kind of technology, from a technological agnostic point of view metrics, and then we have the software committee that are kind of implementing and defining, well, implementing metrics, right? And then after a while, we started to have some discussions around, well, how we can have some place store this OpenStack gender report, because we were producing specific analytics for gender diversity in the OpenStack Foundation, and we thought that it was kind of a really interesting place to have this. So we started conversations, and well, we kind of founded, let's say, this working group. So we are now in Chaos working as working groups. For instance, Dawn is now part of another working group, which is the Common Metrics Working Group, discussing around other things. We have another working group related to risk analysis or value, and well, there are some others. So if you are interested in discussing around all of these topics, we have weekly meetings. You are more than welcome to join. And then after a while, so we have some other people. So we have Emma Irwin from the Mozilla Foundation. We opened the discussion. So Don Foster came as well. Georg. Well, so we are a community, and we are, I would say, doing great things. So this is Chaos.
one of the things that I think is really unique is the way that we come up with metrics. Can you talk a little bit about that methodology that we use?
Yeah, with that respect, so we are using a goal question metric approach. In some other cases, this is named as OKO, objective and key results. Basically what we are defining a set of focused areas, goals that we are trying to achieve. And then based on these goals, we are defining a set of questions that are important for all of us, for all the people involved. And then we are defining a set of metrics. So some examples there, we have like event representation, or we are discussing as focus areas, recognition of good work. So there are several of them. Yeah, this is more or less the methodology we are following.
Yeah, there are 7 categories we've identified that have really become sort of a checklist for other communities to adopt in terms of increasing diversity and inclusion within their own communities. Don, can you talk a little bit about those categories and some of the current work that we're focused on?
Yeah, so within the diversity and inclusion working group, we do have 7 what we call focus areas. And for me, I think the 7 focus areas really help us make sure that we're really focused not just on diversity, but also inclusion, and making sure that we have metrics that look at not just how diverse the community is, but how inclusive are we, how good are we at bringing in new people. And so we have 7 of those. So those are event diversity, contributor community diversity, communication inclusivity, recognition of good work, leadership, governance, and then we have one called project and community, which is kind of the channels that we use for communication. And I think all 7 of these are really important. I mean, if you take event diversity as one example, looking at each of these focus areas has multiple metrics defined within it. And so if you look at event diversity, are your speakers diverse? Are your speakers diverse across all of the tracks? So if you have all of your diverse speakers speaking in a diversity and inclusion track and none of them speaking in another track, maybe you're not as diverse as you think you are. So what we try to do is focus a lot on how do we help people look at across all of the things that they're doing within their open source project and their community to make sure that everything is diverse. So thinking about like communication inclusivity. Are all of your meetings held, in a vocal format? Do you have transcription? Do you have other ways for people to communicate if that's, for whatever reason, not their style or not the best communication mechanism for them? So we have it broken down into a bunch of different areas, and that's all in the repo. So I would encourage you to take a look because it does help you sort of frame the discussions around how do we measure it, and what are the ways that we can make our community more inclusive?
Thank you very much. So Gwen, we first met in the contributor experience SIG, which, as I told you yesterday, I've had such a great experience when I joined a couple of those meetings. And you have a really interesting background, a really great background. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I'm assuming you're referring to my background as a software engineer. So a few years ago, I hadn't really ever touched any kind of programming. I'm a classical musician. I am a professional concert pianist. I do what is called collaborative piano, which is where I work with other musicians and accompany them at the piano for competitions and concerts and events. And as well as dancers, actually. So I made the change into the software industry I had some life things happen, and I live in Seattle, and a lot of my friends are software developers, and so I looked at it and I thought, that actually sounds interesting, like it would never get boring, and it actually comes with job security and benefits. So yeah, those are some real decisions, right? Anyway, I got lucky enough to get accepted into Ada Developers Academy, which is a year-long boot camp in Seattle, and it's actually a really great program and differentiates itself from a lot of other boot camps in that it doesn't charge tuition. It is entirely sponsored by sponsor companies who write your tuition check. they have a pretty low acceptance rate. It's an average about 10% per class, 10% acceptance rate. And the best part, there is a built-in internship. So 5 months of this program you spend working in the industry, being on a team at a company, building connections, getting experience. And the way that I got into the Kubernetes community was that my internship assignment just so happened to be on the cloud native computing team at Samsung in Seattle. And I showed up there on day one and they said, forget everything you learned about full stack web development, welcome to Kubernetes. And it worked out great. It was a small team, I learned a lot, and eventually I got started contributing because, so what happened was one of my coworkers said, hey, you're going to KubeCon, you should try contributing at least once to one of the Kubernetes things. And I said, I'm really intimidated. And he said, oh, no, just like find a spelling error and submit a pull request. And I said, okay. And it was really hard. I found a spelling error. I think it was a grammar error in some file in Kubernetes/community. And the first thing that happened was like, oh, you didn't sign the CLA, it didn't work. There were a bunch of hoops I had to jump through, and it was horrible. And there was one time on Friday at 4 p.m. where I was just waiting for the elevator, bitching about how awful it was. And my coworker said, so what are you going to do about it? So I opened an issue. You can all find my very first issue in the Kubernetes community repo. It is rude. It is impatient. And it clearly shows that I don't understand how open source works. And people said, hey, welcome to open source. Do you want to fix it? So that's when I joined SIG Contributor Experience and rewrote the contributor guide. And PR's accepted, by the way. If you run into trouble, let me know. And that's kind of where it took off from there. Was that too long? I'm sorry. I talked for a long time.
Wow. So that sort of leads into a little bit of what we also talked about yesterday, right? The important relationship between maintainer and the contributors and the fatigue that might happen there and how to be a better contributor and how to lessen some of the maintainer fatigue.
Yeah, so I've been running a new contributor workshop at KubeCons for a year now. The first one was in Copenhagen. And this one was kindly facilitated by Jonas and team, so we're improving it every time we have a KubeCon. And one of the hardest challenges is to get new contributors the last mile to their first contribution, like getting them a supportive on-ramp. And part of the problem is that it's open source, so there really aren't any consequences for dropping off and not following through on something. And so this is where I have to tell new people, really follow through on what you're doing, communicate. If you can't finish something, let people know so someone else can pick up the work. And that is where, it's a huge project. So core maintainers get over 100 emails a day, because they just sit there and have to approve things and they see all the repos, and that becomes quickly really, really difficult and doesn't scale well. So that is one of the challenges we have. How do we continue to support people at all levels of contributorship?
Yeah, thank you very much. Jonas, so one of the things that we've talked about that is very near and dear to my heart is the recognition of both code and non-code contributions. And Danielle mentioned the OpenStack diversity research that we did earlier. One of the things that was really important to me in that research was that we make sure that both code and non-code contributions were encompassed within and represented within that research. Can you talk a little bit about the work that you do in the Kubernetes community?
Yeah, absolutely. So I actually joined the Kubernetes community a year ago over at Contributor Summit in Copenhagen. And after that, I became a member of the Contributor Experience SIG as well. So I've only been with the community for a year, and it is a fantastic community. It was so welcoming, and the first thing I did when I joined the Contributor Experience SIG was I sat down and listened. Because I don't want to barge in and come up with ideas that people have already talked about, but rather I wanted to listen and hear what people had to say and see where I could help. So a couple of weeks pass, and I'm listening, and I'm chatting with a bunch of wonderful people, and we start talking about non-code contributions. And I realized that there are no guidelines on how we actually handle non-code contributions or what kind of non-code contributions that we are looking for. So we started a little sub-project within the Contributor Experience SIG to handle non-code contribution documentation. It ended up being a part of the contributor's guide, so everyone that wants to learn how to contribute to Kubernetes will also see a little link to non-code contributions, because they are super, super important. And what are some of the non-code contributions that we list? Well, for instance, project management, making sure that the project actually flows really well. We have release teams. Marketing is super important for the project as well, making sure that we have a nice looking website.
Contributor Summit.
Contributor Summit, yes. It is crucial that we have all these non-code contributions and non-code roles within the project, but they are hard to measure, as you mentioned before. They are harder to measure because many non-code contributions are made outside of the repository. They are made outside of the core Kubernetes website or the core Kubernetes Slack. Some of the contributions that we list are in real life meetups. Hosting meetups, recording YouTube videos, and creating how-to blogs. Those are amazing non-code contributions that are super hard to keep track of and have proper metrics for. So we're trying to engage with people that are contributing non-code contributions to the project and making sure that we thank them for their contribution. So we retweet their content and things like that. So it's super important that we recognize those contributions because they are critical to the project.
Excellent, thank you.
I think it's worth mentioning that in Chaos, one of the areas we are measuring as non-code contributions is leadership and governance, which is part of the board of the foundation, CNCF. In this case, the analysis we were doing was focused on OpenStack. So we went for the ambassadors, technical committee, the board, and all of this, which is non-code related contributions. And yeah, I think it was worth mentioning.
And like you said, they're more difficult because they're not within a repository.
I just want to share one. I had a great conversation with a new contributor after Contributor Summit who has a doctorate in linguistics. And he wanted to make sure that our documentation is up to par. And he speaks English. He does not speak Hungarian. But even English documentation can somewhat be a little confusing if you're not a native speaker. So if you're not a native speaker of the English language, it might be a little hard to follow some of the documentation. So he took it on himself to kind of dive into the documentation and see if he can correct some of the grammar and making sure that everything looks good from a linguistic point of view. And that's a very, very specific skill that not a lot of people have. And it's super worthwhile to have it because then, based on the English documentation, you might then have translated documentation into Chinese, Korean, Spanish, French. And it's super important that we have correct documentation that we then can span out from, essentially.
Yeah, idioms are actually really hard. I stumbled over that in some of the docs where when I review something for the contributor guide, sometimes people say things like, this will get you most of the way there. And that's kind of, that's a bad example maybe, but things like that, when they use common idioms that are English, they don't translate well. And it makes it less accessible, for sure.
Yeah, one of the things I really like about the Kubernetes community, so I'm also part of the contributor experience SIG, but there's a ton of mentorship that goes on within the Kubernetes community. There are regular Meet Our Contributors meetings, there are regular office hours, there's a whole program around becoming a release shadow so that you could eventually possibly become a release lead. So you basically shadow a release manager and you can kind of try it out, see if it's for you before you take on any real responsibility. And so I think a lot of those programs also really help with making Kubernetes a more inclusive community.
You know, I would really be remiss not to mention what I said yesterday, which is I started my open source journey in OpenStack, which is why the diversity research started there, because there were a lot of good things that were happening within that community that another colleague of ours and I wanted to bring over into the Linux community. And then I started to dive into the Kubernetes community. And really, my first stop was, hey, Jonas, where do you think I should dive in? And it was actually last summer in Portland at the Community Leadership Summit. And I remember you and Paris, Pittman and I and a few others actually going to a Starbucks across the street, and he recommended that I dial into the contributor experience SIG. And it was one of the most welcoming. I thought OpenStack community was fantastic. It was one of the most welcoming communities. Was really just blown away by really impressed by how welcoming everybody was there. You know, it was not intimidating at all. So, thank you.
What do you think are some of the things? I'm sorry, I'm like asking you a question now. Can I do that? Is that part of the? What do you think were some of the things that made it so welcoming when you joined? Because we would like to know.
So I remember not saying much initially, and I was like, "Oh gosh, is this going to be okay?" I'm not really saying much. I have the virtue of well, now my fiance is an open source, so I would kind of talk to him behind the scenes, right, and say, "I'm really not saying much on these calls. Is this okay?" And he'd say, "It's okay to just sit back and just listen to the conversations, listen to what's happening, listen to the tone, listen to what's going on, and you know, then once you get a sense of things, then step forward where you think you can provide value." I'm in advocacy. I was a journalism undergrad, right? So a marketing master's, and so so my expertise is really more in that vein. So I, you know, contribute in those ways. You were, and actually, Gwen, you were one of the ones that was like, "Wow, she's like really nice." Oh, and so in addition to having already known Jonas, which was a bonus, right? I mean, that was wonderful. I already knew you walking in the door, right? A proverb or virtual door, so to speak. But just you were just super nice. I mean, everybody was really nice. And I remember Paris saying, I said something kind of at the end of one of the calls where you know, do you remember that? But I didn't feel pressured. There wasn't any pressure, I guess, right? And so that was part of it. Was I could kind of go at my own pace, and I felt comfortable to do that. And so, okay, now I have a sense of who the different folks are and what, you know, and then I felt comfortable to speak. Right, to speak up and lean in, or whatever words you want to use there. Yeah, I felt comfortable to actually introduce myself, and actually Paris at that point said, you know, "Oh, good," you know, and actually said, "Good, I'm glad you did that." But just the way that you reached out, you know, on the call, the way that everybody reached out was wonderful. I don't know if that directly answers your question. It's more nebulous.
Yeah, I think it kind of touches on one of the main points with like diversity and inclusion, where we can all try to have those tracks and like be separate and be diverse somewhere at a conference, but that's like just one side of the coin, and in a way it's unfair to put the pressure on the people who are trying to break in. It's actually on everybody to make sure that everyone has a place.
Yeah. Yeah, it was just a no pressure environment. Yeah. Excellent.
Did I totally derail you? I'm sorry.
No, I'm not sure I gave you know, it was more a nebulous, soft answer, but it was, I go by feeling, and so it was more a feeling than anything else. But, yeah. And you know, I guess I should also, there was an InnerSource meetup earlier this week as well. And there are things that are in common with I think the Kubernetes community and the contributor experience SIG that I talked about in that meetup during the presentation, which is there's a high level of, this is going to sound, but there's a high level of psychological safety, a high level of trust, a high level of I have your back, which is, by the way, one of the reasons that I participate in the Chaos Project D&I Workgroup, is I feel like it's a real team. We're working together, we're collaborating, and I really do mean that from the heart. So I feel good about the work that we're doing. So to go to the audience, does anyone have any questions for the panelists?
I'll run the mic.
So when it comes to like metrics and such, do you feel like you have seen it make an impact on the inclusion in the groups that you've been active in? Like visualizing the metrics that you have been able to gather? Have you seen an impact on the amount of the inclusion in the communities?
In terms of metrics, one of the analyses we were doing was focused on outreach, how outreach was working in terms of attracting and retaining developers. So we were comparing this, well, we were comparing 40 people against 7,000, which is not comparable at all. But it happened that at OpenStack Foundation, the average was around 10, 11 months of contributions. At least we were covering code reviews, emails, and commit activity, these kind of things. While in outreach, we discovered that the numbers were a bit higher, so we were kind of being retained or contributing for a bit longer time, like 14, 15 months, which, well, this doesn't mean necessarily anything, but these are some numbers that we can start working at. And then I remember I presented some other numbers about the Linux kernel in LinuxCon Berlin a couple of 3-4 years ago. There were some numbers about how outreach was impacting somehow in the number of contributions. We saw some peaks of activity. So it's this concept of mentorship, how to help people. I think people have this feeling of being part of something, as you said, being part of a community, of a team, and this helps to be retained for a longer time. Of course, the analysis we were doing was mostly focused on numbers, so quantitative approach. We are now willing to do a more qualitative approach, to go to the people and directly ask what you said, what it means for you, right?
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that's interesting. If you look through some of the metrics that we've defined across the focus areas for working groups, for the diversity and inclusion working group, is there are tons of qualitative metrics in addition to the quantitative ones. So not just counting, the number of people or counting diversity in some way, but asking people, did you feel included on a scale of whatever? And so we're trying to also encourage people to do a few more things that are a little more qualitative so they can better understand maybe where their gaps are.
Yeah, one of the things that we are planning on doing for the new contributor workshop is to check in with people who did the workshop in the past and see, like, send out a questionnaire and ask them, but also kind of look at their contributions across the repositories in the Kubernetes community and see, you know, who had a successful on-ramp and is on their way to becoming a maintainer, because that's the end goal.
There's another question over here.
Hello, I'm David. I would like to know how you can get feedback from the people that do not stay in the community or do not stay with you without putting pressure or things like that. How can you get feedback from the people that drop off, more or less?
Is the question how we gather feedback from people that are leaving the community? Or?
Yeah,
okay.
and why? Because that's why they are leaving.
And why they're leaving?
Yeah.
I think that's always hard to gather because they might leave and not talk to us. I think that's of course something that happens. Within the Kubernetes community, people are fairly vocal, and we give them space to be vocal. Of course, there are conversations and discussions and things like that we can see, but if the discussions that lead to them leaving the community are had behind other closed doors or something that we can't see, then it's very hard for us to track it.
One of the ways in which you can very explicitly leave is if you are a reviewer or a maintainer in a repository. We have owners' files. That is how our automation and review process manages large community at scale. And we are moving directly towards, if you don't want to be a maintainer or a reviewer anymore, you have to, we call it PRing out. So you submit a pull request and that says, remove so-and-so from owner's file because somebody says, you know, I'm leaving the industry. I am changing jobs. I'm now working on closed source. You know, I no longer feel like I bring value to this part. Any reason, but literally then we have a concrete, measurable, you know, tagged commit that says, oh, that person's not there anymore. But that obviously only really works for the higher levels of the contributor ladder.
But this also makes it clearer for us, so we don't have people that are listed as being in charge when they're not in charge anymore or shouldn't be in charge anymore. So just as an example, we have a friend of ours in the contributor experience. He said, I don't have time to manage events anymore. I'm focusing on other things this year. So he said, remove me from the events owners. Simple, perfect, then we know, then we won't ping you, and we won't be angry because you're not answering. So it helps by being very clear and having that clear communication. And the owner's files is, of course, part of the Kubernetes automation. And one of the values for the Kubernetes project is automation over process. So making sure that we have those clear responsibilities documented properly in an automated way helps everyone, essentially. But it is very specific to the Kubernetes project, definitely.
Hello. So my question is for all of you, actually. I'm curious to know what you're doing to diversify your panel, for example, beyond gender, because I think the question that this gentleman just asked as to how you make people who are generally outside the community, how you make them feel safer and more willing to answer questions. I think actually something that's really important for that is representation. If you don't see yourself represented within the people who are asking you these questions, then there's a very huge likelihood that you're not going to feel safe and you're not going to feel comfortable answering these questions. So I want to know what you're doing to make sure you're proactively, you know, trying to make your space diverse beyond gender.
Yeah, I sat down on this panel and I looked around And I'm just going to say it outright. This panel is super white, y'all. That's not okay. And on the other hand, it's this, for me, it's always this struggle between, do I ask the people who are underrepresented to do more work? Or do I try to figure out what they need so that I can do that work for them? So a couple of the things we do are generally, Jonas already mentioned, translating the docs into other languages. That actually does really, really help with accessibility for the project. When we have meetings, we ask that everyone put down their attendance in a Google Doc, and then we ask a new person to introduce themselves if they want to. And it is okay if you don't want to do that. We try to encourage peer mentoring, like short mentoring, one-on-one, and try to be really, really available when somebody needs assistance. And I personally try to like reach out more because sometimes it's hard for people to speak up. I have no trouble speaking up, but I know that's not the story for everybody.
Are we over time?
I think so.
Gotcha.
We can definitely continue the conversation outside, though.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so please find us outside and we'll chat more.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks.